on the continent. We, in other people's perceptions, don't have such a good track record when it comes to that. What comes to mind are the goings-on in the CAR, Egypt. Well, how important are free and fair elections on the African continent?
I believe free and fair elections are the ballast of peace and stability anywhere. In all human societies, when people are aware, naturally they would demand that they are treated with due respect, and if truly power resides in them, then whoever wants to take the power to serve them should ensure that things are done properly with due respect, transparency and accountability to the people. Otherwise, the spring, Arab Spring or whatever it's called, would happen.
The economic outlook for the African continent is very rosy for the next decade. 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are on the African continent. The key to all of this, though, is strengthening democracy throughout the continent. How important is South Africa playing a leading role in that? And then how do you build on that democracy strengthening throughout the rest of the continent to really cash in on the economic outlook?
I believe your question entails the answer. If the key to prosperity, growth, stability is in democracy, then I believe Africa, which is rising, because for centuries Africa had been pressed so hard down under. That is, Africa is bouncing back, and it's only 50 years or so. Ghana was the first to have gained independence as recent as 1957. Africa, with its inordinate natural resources, good people too, should be so concerned to marshal its resources in such a way as to enable it leapfrog into the mainstream of globalization. Otherwise, Africa would be kept in the margins and would be kept cheated by the rest of the world. The African Union, I believe, saw through this challenge, and this is why in the constitutive act of the Union, Africa converted itself from the Organization of African Unity, which was more for liberation from colonialism, into African Union, which is more for economic growth, prosperity for the people, for the continent or so. And the Union insisted on democratization, ruling by constitutions, legitimate constitutions, which enshrine respect for human rights. So Africa is aware, and Africa is moving for democratization. This is why all over the continent now, the so-called strongmen are sort of fast receding, and rather we see the ballot box coming into operation to pick governments and also to undo governments that the people who decide are not performing.
South Africa is celebrating 20 years of freedom this year. That coincides with these elections that we have at the moment. We've been called the gateway into Africa. We know that your chair, Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, hails from South Africa. How important is a strong and democratic South Africa to the rest of the continent?
I've always said South Africa is structurally a bridging nation for Africa. You are industrialized, even though in parts you are still like developing. You are now one of the BRICS of the world. And you know the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa is one of them. Africa needs to move out of underdevelopment and the categorization of developing into growing industrialization, improving quality of life for the people, using our resources, which are abundant. In fact, they rank second to none around the world. What I believe the factor that must be captured and nurtured very fast is leadership. And South Africa being industrialized, and also at the same time knowing what underdevelopment is, should use its opportunities to give leadership to Africa. You should radiate development on the continent. And I believe the continent looks up to South Africa as a lead country. And the bridging concept is that you, at once being developed and at once being underdeveloped, should be seen as the example for emulation on the continent. For Africa to quickly, instead of Africa looking to Europe or to America or China or wherever, we can look at South Africa, find the solutions.
How do we, though, on the continent, how do we take our natural resources and develop the continent and stave off the threats that we faced the last 300 years of outside forces coming and using our resources and leaving nothing behind? How do we overcome that?
I've talked of leadership, and fortunately our constitutions all over tend to be enlightened. They talk of respect for human rights. They talk of provision of social services like education, healthcare, good governance in terms of law and order. They talk of transparency and accountability of governments, of the governors to the governed. When things are arranged this way, people who get the privilege to lead would deliver, would give solutions. And as I say, we learn by examples, and we've got the African Union holding us together, and the regional groupings like SADC here, ECOWAS in West Africa and other places. So we learn from each other. The African Union, through NEPAD, is talking of partnerships for Africa to move fast. Partnerships not only among ourselves on the continent, but also partnerships with the rest of the world that will show good faith to Africa. And when we have good leadership, even into partnerships, we negotiate well for the interests of Africa.
Is the problem maybe not on the continent that we pick, instead of leadership, we become obsessed with leaders instead, and therein lies part of our problem?
We are growing out of that. Leaders are not servants of people, then they are not leaders. A leader who, when he looks back over his shoulder, won't see the people coming along with him, is not a leader. And I'm telling you, with enlightenment, people won't give their power through their votes to so-called leaders who would come and only continue to perpetuate all the wrongs that we suffered under colonialism and slavery.
Now, on the issue of leadership as well, as the African Union and members thereof, is there will and is there muscle as well to hold your peers on the continent accountable to protect democracy in each and every country on the continent?
Africa is rising. They say Rome was not built in a day. Within just 2 decades, if you would care to check, you'll be surprised how far Africa has come. The Union, when it decided on NEPAD, to form NEPAD, the new Partnership for Africa's Development, also formed a body to be voluntarily subscribed to, Africa Peer Review. Incidentally, I was then president of Ghana, and Ghana was the first to have been peer reviewed. And the whole idea was for governments to submit the governance of their nation to be peer reviewed by fellow African nations which were part of the peer review mechanism. And as I said, Ghana was the first to have been peer reviewed. The chairman for the eminent people who came to peer review Ghana, incidentally, happened to have been former governor of the Central Bank of South Africa. They came out of courtesy. They only greeted president, but then they were given freedom of the nation. So they looked at all the different aspects of governance and then objectively made a report, which ended up in a tome, a copy of which was then sent to the president of the government of Ghana, and then a copy sent to the African Union Authority. And then later, President of Ghana was summoned to appear before the peers to account. Governance. How well are you doing with the management of the economy of the country? How well are you doing with respect for human rights? Say the courts of Ghana, the freedom of media, recognition of civil society organizations, gender balance, provision of basic social services like education, giving equality of opportunity to all the people. These things happen. And this was, I think, about 9 years back. That when we formed the peer review mechanism, as I said, voluntarily, the original subscribers of the continent were something like about 20-something countries. Others were dragging their feet. The African Union has a membership of, I believe, 53 countries or 54 countries now. Only 20-something originally. As we speak, I believe the number has increased to over 30, which shows the trend where Africa is going. This will ensure that governments would know that they should operate to the tenets and principles of the constitutive acts of the continent.
And should not be complacent and take the electorate for
The
granted.
days of strong men are over. We want democracy, power of the people to be operative.
Where else can we leave that discussion but there? The days of the strong men are over. We want a democracy. My thanks to you so much for having joined us, His Excellency John Kufuor.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. It's nice to hear that you're endorsing the African century that's coming up. We believe that, and we believe more days like yesterday and today is needed on the continent. Thank you, Your Excellency, for joining us.
Indeed. Even it shouldn't be an anomaly. It should be something that happens throughout the continent. And of course, with democracy comes stability. And when you have stability, you have the likes of what you were talking about, intra-Africa trade, where we begin to look at ourselves as a continent for the solutions of Africa. Majority are found on the African soil. We're rich in resources, we're rich in minerals, and we need to step up in the role of leadership.
Fortunately, Ayanda, the outlook is very good. It's in our hands, as Nelson Mandela said. It's up to us to now go out and really make this the African century.
Indeed, it is. And turning our attention back home now, we had